This is Innovation Day, so we'll be presenting on 2 innovation policies and the very innovative work that China is doing in this space, one of the great innovators in the green transition. Okay, without further ado, I'll get to my presentation. This is a piece of work that I've been doing with Professor Doan Farmer, who spent about a decade working on innovation and technological progress. And my colleague, Dr. Rupert Way, who's been looking at modelling this transition. And basically what I'm going to present here is a question of whether decision makers are getting the right information about climate mitigation pathways. What might be wrong with that story that they're being presented with? Is there a better perspective? What is the cost of decarbonising our global energy system given this new perspective? And what does that mean for China? And some conclusions. So this is what we're presented with usually in terms of decarbonisation pathways. That thick black line is our emissions growing through time up to around 40 gigatons per year by 2020. If we continue on that path, you get the pathways that go up there to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, which will be a very difficult world to live in. But if we manage to turn the ship around and get the emissions down quickly enough, we get hopefully down to less than 2 degrees. Those blue lines there are the 1.5 Paris Agreement aligned pathways. Now, I don't have any problem with how this is presented. This is the great uncertainty we have around our future. So there is a wide spread of possibilities. My problem is how the integrated assessment modeling community is representing that less than 2 degrees scenario and how difficult it might be to achieve that. In their models, economic growth usually has to suffer because if economic growth is reined in, emissions, of course, are reduced. Alternatively, you can reduce your energy usage. That will also bring down your emissions. And if you can do that to the nth degree, as much as you can, you still have to do quite a lot of carbon capture and storage. In the most optimistic scenario, or around the average for Paris, it's around 13 gigatons per year by 2100, by the end of the century. To give you an idea of what that means, there is a plant out in Canada called Quest that sequesters 1 million tons of CO2 a year. In order to achieve that goal of 13 gigatons, we would have to build one of those plants every 2 to 3 days for the next 80 years. So that's quite an engineering challenge. And because carbon capture and storage is a cost on top of producing energy, the electricity, it's likely that will lead to electricity prices being higher. Now, what's wrong with this perspective? What's wrong with this story? Well, one problem with this story is that how some of the new clean technologies are represented in these models is really quite poor. On the graph on the left there, you see the dotted line, the dots of solar PV modules coming down in cost through time. That's a logarithmic scale. So that red line is one of the International Energy Agency's projections in 2000. Their projection of what the cost would be in 2020 is an order of magnitude above what ended up being the cost. So it's 10 times more than what the price actually ended up being in 2020. And what you can see is they're consistently, systematically wrong. All those lines from the integrated assessment models, the blue and red lines, are on the right-hand side of that actual graph. There's no lines on the left-hand side. So there's a systemic bias. If this was just random chance, they would have some lines that were too optimistic. And another problem is shown on the right-hand side is floor costs. What you will do if you don't believe that solar or these technologies will come down in cost, you have an expert that will tell you that there is a reason why they can't go down below a certain cost. So you put that cost in your model. The problem is the cost of solar has broken through most of those floor costs that have been put into those models through time. So they're getting something wrong there. And understanding technology progress and technology costs is not easy. If you look at the problem from the perspective of systems thinking, one problem that is very difficult to model is the feedback dynamics you get in the system with learning by doing. So when you deploy more of some of these technologies, the costs come down. When the costs come down, more people demand these technologies, so you deploy more. Because you deployed more, the costs come down. You've got a positive feedback dynamic there. Those positive feedback dynamics end up giving you exponential growth. And that's why that curve there is close to straight on a logarithmic graph. That cost is coming down exponentially because you've got this dynamic. Another problem with these models is they're really big. They're really complex models. There's not one person that knows the whole of any one model. There's massive teams involved and they can take up to a month to run. So they get out of date rather quickly. And that's problematic. This is the PV cost projections for the most recent AR5 integrated assessment models. And that's their projections going forward to 2050. This is what actually happened in PV in China in the last 5 years. So already the cost of solar is below most of the, if not all of the projections in 2020. Even worse than that, it's below most of the projections in 2050. So you can imagine these models will not incorporate enough solar PV in their models if they're out of date so quickly. And these technologies are changing so quickly, it's not surprising that they're not able to keep up. So is there a better perspective? Well, this is the relationship we're looking at here. On the left-hand side, you've got the costs of various energy sources. You've got in brown and black and grey, you've oil, coal and gas for the last century. When you adjust for inflation, the costs haven't changed much in the last century, no more than an order of magnitude. And then literally coming down out of the heavens, that orange line, the cost of solar, which has dramatically dropped over the last 50 years to the point where it's in price parity or close to with those competing technologies, fossil fuels. You also can see the blue line there, which is wind, green, which is electrolyzers used for storage. We've got batteries in that as well. On the right-hand side, you can see the relation in terms of deployment. So the more you deploy, the more the costs come down. And you can see the deployment for solar and wind and electrolyzers going up at a rapid rate. So exponential growth in the deployment of these technologies, which leads possibly to exponential decline in costs. So what we did is looked at technological progress through this lens. One of the things that you can see about looking at many different technologies is most technologies, inflation adjusted, don't have their cost decline much through time. You can see most of the bell curve there is around zero. So most of this is from the price of the annual growth rate in price of US manufacturing goods between 1958 and 2011. So a negative number means the cost has come down. Zero means the costs haven't changed over that period. So most of the goods are around that, not coming down. But there's some goods like electronic computers that have come down quite dramatically in their costs through time. So that's one thing. Different technologies have different technological progress rates. Also, as you can see in this graphic here, there's a real consistency in how these technologies progress in terms of their cost declines. Up at the top, if there's any mothers and fathers in this group, you can see something you've seen happening in your life, that hospital services, college tuitions, and so forth are going up in costs fairly regularly. And you've got some technologies there that haven't changed much, like cars and furnishing. But then look at televisions, computer software, and notice how consistent those declines are through time. So once a technology becomes established, you can actually get a fairly consistent decline in, you can get a fairly consistent picture of how their costs will progress through time. So how can we take advantage of these trends? Well, there are some empirical laws that have been developed. You're probably familiar to Gordon laws, Gordon Moore's law, which was a relationship that he found between the processing power of computer chips that were doubling every 2 years. That has obvious implications for costs. And basically it says that the costs have a relationship through time. An alternative and older law is known as Wright's law, which Paul Theodore Wright is an interesting guy. Back in World War II, was helping produce aeroplanes for the war effort. And what he found was the more they produced of these planes, the cheaper the cost got. They learned by doing. And that's why in his work, cumulative production is used as a proxy for experience. And he found that when you produce more, when you double the amount that you've deployed, your costs come down at a fairly consistent rate. Both of these laws work rather well for quite a wide range of technologies. As you can see there on the graphic, there's transistors, photovoltaics, hard disk drives, and ethanol processing. Each of those work fairly well using both Moore's and Wright's law. Wright's law is important because it has policy implications. The government can do something about it. Investors can do something about it. The more you deploy of these technologies, the more the cost will come down. What we did and what Doan's group did, that is, many people have been using both Moore's and Wright's law to understand technological change through time. What Doan's group did was apply a methodology to that allows us to come up with consistent and reliable error bars associated with those projections into the future. So they validated it over 50 technologies and provided these experience curves that forecast the costs into the future given a certain deployment rate. This was published in 2016, and you can see from what happened since they published that they got things fairly right, although the costs came down a little bit faster than their median level. That was within the bounds of uncertainty that they'd predicted. So how can we make use of this, and what might it do to change their perspective of how fast and how cheaply we can decarbonize our energy system? So look at this graphic again that I showed you. If we take one of the International Energy Agency's projections from 2019 and convert it into a global energy system, you'll see here that the fossil fuel industry declines somewhat through time. The blue is electricity. Most of that is through renewables, but some through carbon capture and storage. And you see emissions coming down by about 30% in this scenario by 2040. So you get progress towards the Paris goals, but change is not really happening fast enough. Alternatively, if we put in our future projections of PV costs into the same sort of model, we get a very different picture. Things don't change much for the first 5 years, then you get that exponential growth. And that's the thing with exponential growth. Nothing happens for a long time, then wham, it hits you. This is predicated on us continuing our aggressive deployment of these technologies like solar and wind and batteries and so forth. So this is not necessarily what's going to happen, but we are only just using the same trends that have been happening for the last 20 years and projecting them forward another decade before they then dominate the energy system and we taper them off. And what you should notice here is that the fossil fuel industry in this scenario is only about less than 20% of what it was in 2020, and your emissions are reduced by 80%. So basically that'll put you on the Paris alignment, as I will show. And what does that mean for the costs? Well, to do that, we had to build an empirically grounded technological forecast modeling. We applied our statistical analysis to oil, coal, and gas, and so came up with a prediction of how they would move through time. Not surprisingly, they continue on their same trend. And then we apply that also to a number of different technologies, the key technologies being solar and wind for generating electricity, and then batteries for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and then electrolyzers for producing hydrogen for seasonal storage and for some of those hard to abate sectors like shipping and steel and so forth. And we built a model that provides about 90% of the final energy of the global system. I won't go into that details, but all you really need to know is we've got two scenarios. One that has the system as it is with dispatchable baseload energy. In another scenario, the fast transition, that is rapidly replaced by renewables plus battery. And for your liquid fuels, that's replaced by renewables plus hydrogen, probably shipped around as ammonia, which is a very efficient way of transporting hydrogen. And so you can actually replace the entire fossil fuel energy system with this combination of renewables plus batteries plus hydrogen. And so if you do that, if you do a fast transition to these technologies, what will you get as opposed to no transition? Well, we find that we actually save trillions with this fast transition. The median total savings is around 26 trillion by 2070. What you can see there is the total cost of the energy system growing through time in three different scenarios. The bar on the left is the no transition, so keeping the same energy mix. We slow down the deployment of renewables, and we keep the fossil fuel system we've got, and we grow everything at 2% annually. Alternatively, we still grow everything 2% annually, but we transition rapidly with the blue one to non-fossil fuels, so solar, wind, batteries, electrolyzers. And you can see that rapid transition happening with the blue thick bars declining. So most of the energy system is decarbonised and based on renewables by 2050. And because the height of the bars are different, the gap between each of those bars every year adds up to about 26 trillion in the median case. So we're saving money by going to this system. We should actually be doing it regardless of climate change. And what does that mean for China? Well, a number of people have questioned what we've done and said, well, what does it mean in terms of regional differences? There's going to be places where the sun isn't as good or the wind isn't as good. Well, one important thing to note, this is the cost of solar installation going down through time. Each of those bubbles is an installation of solar. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the installation. And what you can see is the trend is that they're declining through time. But also that band, which is the 95th to the 5th percentile, so the majority of that data is in that band. The laggards, the ones that are at the top, the slowest, in 10 years, their costs are below the 5th percentile, the best 10 years ago. So technological progress is overcoming all of those regional differences quite quickly. And China, if you look at the spread of all the different countries, is doing particularly well in that regard. That is because solar is close to price parity in most parts of China, if not now, then it will be in the next 5 years. So renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. That's not renewables plus storage. So at some point, you're going to have to compare solar and batteries to fossil fuels. But what you've got here is a disruptive technology. So very interesting times at the moment. And what you can also see there in the graph on the left is the module costs aren't that much different between the different countries. Some of the major differences are actually in those soft costs, in financing and in installation of these technologies. And that's learning by doing. Those countries on the right-hand side aren't necessarily the countries that have the best solar or wind. They're the countries that have learned by doing, by installing the most solar and wind.
So I can unmute this, you can hear him.
But that's not to say that China is not going to have difficulty in this transition. I think many countries will. China has a very young and large coal industry. And some of the projections that have been done at the national level, this one is from He et al. 2020, shows that there's a fairly dramatic decline in jobs in the coal industry that could happen during this transition. A lot of that is happening already through automation, but there is still the impact that this is going to have on the coal industry in terms of jobs. The analysis that some of my colleagues at Oxford have done have shown that there is actually more jobs in renewables. Coal wages are, and oil and gas wages are potentially higher on average, but the wages for renewables are at least above average. but the most concerning thing really is that there's going to be significant regional and skill shortages. So stranded locations rather than stranded assets necessarily. And finally, China has a heck of a lot to gain from this situation. They are the country that has gained the most from the green growth that has been happening over the last 5 to 10 years. And most of those gains have been through the exports of renewable energy products. So China really is in the pole position to gain the most from this greening of the energy system. And I can only but encourage them to continue in that trend because I think they'll have some pleasant surprises in terms of costs. So my conclusions, to compare what I've done to what you're getting from the IPCC, which makes you believe that getting to 2 degrees will require our economic growth to suffer or energy usage to be reduced, or we need enormous amounts of carbon capture and storage, heroic amounts, and electricity prices are going to be higher. Alternatively, this fast transition here doesn't require any economic growth reductions. That might be a good idea, and same with energy use reductions. Actually, that's a very good idea, and it's going to make both of those scenarios cheaper. So we should be doing that, but we don't require that for our results here. We don't require carbon capture and storage either. But when we get to that point, you can see there that we're not down to zero in this scenario because there's many other sources of emissions that need to be abated. So we will very likely, extremely likely, need carbon capture and storage and quite a bit of it. And so we've got to build up that capacity. And my colleague, Myles Allen, will be presenting on an approach to ensure that we do have that capability when we need it, and we need it now. Finally, because we're not using as much carbon capture and storage, and we're relying on technologies that costs decline in, we found that electricity prices could actually be dramatically different. 1/3 of business as usual. And as you can imagine, that can do a lot for sustainable development goals. So there's an opportunity here to change the mood music that's being played to decision makers, that a continued strong growth in investment in key renewable and storage technologies, as was presented in the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda over the next decade, will put us on track to meeting the Paris emissions goals, will cost trillions less than business as usual, will need not reduce economic prosperity. Actually, it could actually increase prosperity. In history, every time that we've got access to cheap energy, we've had a boom, we've had an economic resurgence. And that's very likely to happen in a fast transition. China in particular, and my colleague Professor Lee will be talking about the challenges faced by China, are difficult and they must be addressed, but there is much to gain from this clean energy transition, including a huge growth in exports of these products. If you're interested in what I've presented, please go to the energychallenge.info website for more information. Thank you. We should probably go straight to the next talk unless there's any burning questions in the audience here. We've got some in the, we can hear, technology costs may be reducing, but does your approach take account of the material resources extraction impacts and the embodied carbon in making, distributing and disposing of these technologies? That's an excellent question, Tony. Thank you. Actually, I've been bashing the International Energy Agency a bit here, and now I'm going to talk about the good work that they're doing in actually looking at the material resource requirements of the technological trends that we're seeing. And yes, we're going from a fossil fuel-based system to a material-based system. So you will actually have growth in the materials that are going to be required. And that is one of the reasons some people put in these models, you know, these barriers to us, you know, doing this rapid transition. However, one thing these models, and as a modeler myself, I know is it's difficult. It's fairly simple to put these barriers into the models to say that they're not going to be able to do this, they're not going to be able to do that. What we're not very good at modeling is human ingenuity, our ability to overcome these problems. Elon Musk is facing a problem with nickel and cobalt in his batteries. He's talking about sidestepping that to using iron, which is quite abundant. in a certain number of batteries. You can't do it in all because it's a heavier metal, but you know, there are solutions to some of these problems, and we've shown consistently, and actually that's what the experience curves show. They show the problems that we've encountered. There was a balsa wood shortage for wind at one point, and then we overcame that. And so the rate at which we are able to overcome those problems is what actually makes up the experience curve, and what makes the experience curve a good conduit for understanding how the pace of progress could go.